Well, Father Denis, thank you for being with us today. I know you're celebrating right now, your 46th year as a Jesuit priest. I think that's what the figures come out. You were ordained in 1969?
That's correct.
Is it?
Yeah.
Good. What's it like to be a Jesuit priest? Because Jesuits are kind of mystic order, isn't it? I mean, you're kind of rebels, I think, aren't you?
Well, sometimes that's the popular understanding. What happened historically is Ignatius was converted from the life of a courtesan in Spain in the 16th century, and he founded a religious order among a number of graduate students up at the University of Paris, where he was studying, and he learned the hard way how to study, and then was able to get a degree in theology, and he wanted to organize those men to become missionaries. I think in the United States, because we have so many schools here, high schools and universities, that we're considered an order of educators. It's one of our apostolates, but essentially a Jesuit is a missionary priest, and he took those graduate students after they pronounced vows to enter religious life down to Rome and offered their services to the Holy Father at the time, and said he wanted to send our men where we were needed. And it happened that was coincidental with the age of exploration and, unfortunately, colonialization. So you had two things going on at the same time, the cross and the sword. But as our people got spread out across the world, we were asked to establish what they called colleges then, which might have been the equivalent of high schools today. And eventually that developed in different countries according to the laws of those countries into a system of high schools and ultimately universities, as we have here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. What enticed you to become a Jesuit?
Well, I went to a Jesuit high school in San Francisco. I grew up and lived in Oakland, California. And my dad had sent my older brother to the Jesuits for high school. And when my time came, I asked to follow him and go there. And it was a wonderful experience. We had a lot of young Jesuits in those days who were on the teaching faculty. And these guys were only a few years older than us. So they were our coaches in speech and athletics, dramatics, and so forth, and quite inspirational. And I also had a drama director. Mm-hmm. I was in musicals and plays, and he was a convert to Catholicism, and he wanted to enter the Jesuits, and I ended up following them all into the training.
So he was your Pied Piper then, huh?
I guess so. I owe him a lot. His name is Dick McCurdy. And my dad always told me that if I had any happiness in my vocation as a Jesuit, I really owed it to a Baptist professor of history of education that he had studied under at the University of California. And in the course of studying the history of education, this professor dwelt a lot on the Jesuits and their ability to reach out to the minds in a world that was undergoing a lot of revolutions in science and in philosophy and theology at the time. It was also the time of the Reformation of our church by the Protestants, and this man had great respect for the Jesuits, and so my dad sent me there.
So you've spent most of your career, your life as a Jesuit, really in the classroom?
Pretty much focused on education, that's right. And I'm a product of the 1960s. I was in theology, entered theology in 1966, which is just a year after the closure of Vatican II. And so we had the advantage of a lot of intensive scripture study based on some of the reform movements that had been sparked by the thinking of the Vatican Council. And of course, our whole country was going wild at that time. We had race riots, we had civil rights issues, we had the war in Vietnam. People were going in many different directions, and I had aspirations after teaching high school for 3 years in San Francisco to perhaps become a high school principal. And so I got permission to study at University of Southern California in the summer to examine the possibility of a degree that would lead me into high school administration. And the course I took was in a field. I needed one course to get a lifetime credential for the state of California. So I studied philosophy of education, and I was having a cup of coffee with the professor one day, and he asked me why I was there. And I said, well, I'm kind of looking over your school to see about a master's degree in secondary school administration. And he said, we already have a master's degree in philosophy. Why don't you join this department and get a doctorate? So I ended up getting a doctorate in philosophical foundations of education with a minor emphasis on secondary school administration. I never was a high school principal.
Do you regret that? I mean, that was a goal, but...
Well, it would have been interesting to have some time of training as a building administrator. And I was assigned to our high school in Phoenix, Arizona, as an assistant principal, but I never got into that job because my provincial at the time wanted me to become the temporary director of studies for our younger men. And so I had to leave Phoenix, and I was working for a time as the acting dean of our collegiate program at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And then during that year, our vice provincial, who was in charge of education, asked me to be his assistant for the high schools. So I had a dual job for the next 8 years. I was the delegate for the high schools and spent most of my time living out of the trunk of a car, and spent a week in each high school visiting the family and the faculty. And we became interested in those days, this was the mid-1970s, in faculty development and getting people to understand that teaching in a Catholic high school is really a form of ministry. And so we had programs and welcomed the lay faculty into our houses in a much better way than we had done before. So they got to understand us and what our motivation was and what we'd like to carry on. I think it was providential because with the loss of Jesuit manpower over the years due to death and attrition, departures, our schools right now are by and large in the hands of lay people, but we do the best we can to try to pass on the charism of St. Ignatius and Jesuit spirituality to the people working in our institutions.
As you just said, of course, it's changed dramatically from when you were teaching in the 70s. Has the curriculum changed? Has the atmosphere changed in the Catholic schools from that to today's world?
I think so. I think for a long time we were known for concentration on the ancient classics. So Latin and Greek, I mean, I wetted my teeth in high school education on Latin and Greek. And those are now only electives in our school. The real emphases today are on math, science, computer education, electronics, and, of course, your field of communication arts. Mm-hmm. And we still try to provide what was always the ideal in Jesuit education of a well-rounded person. And, of course, we have developed, not in all our high schools, but in some, into coeducational institutions. So we have a lot of women on faculty now. We have women administrators who function as deans and counselors for our students. So we try to be more inclusive, both in language and in outreach to people.
You have to stay on the heartbeat, obviously, of the country and the world as a whole today. We communicate so easily any place that you want to be, and of course, everybody wants to have that ability as a student, I presume. Some of us, like myself, don't quite get all of the whistles and bells that you get on an iPhone and an iPad and so forth. I think it has to do probably with age more than anything else, because if these kids aren't rounded in this today, they won't get too far.
That's correct. And of course, a 5-year-old can teach me things about the computer and the iPhone that I just barely manage to function these days.
Mm-hmm. Now, as a Jesuit, just to say that in the last few years, because of Pope Francis, the Jesuits have come to the top of the information pecking order, I guess you might say, because he comes from the Jesuit world. How has that affected the order itself in your vision?
Well, first of all, I think we're complimented by the College of Cardinals that elected him and chose him to be our leader. I think that we are very much aware of Pope Francis's origins in Latin America. He is a product of the society that has developed there from the very dark days of the dictatorships in South America and Central America especially, and the development of the various, there isn't just one, but there are varied theologies of liberation. And so following the inspiration of the Dominican theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, the emphasis in contemporary theology in Latin America is on orthopraxis. Now, overseas in Rome, for centuries, because of the Protestant Reformation and the influence of the Enlightenment, of the revolutions that took place in Europe and around the globe, our church was rather fearful and became a bit ghettoized, and so we were concentrating on orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. Well, Gutierrez says orthopraxis is where we should be basing our focus. So what it comes down to, in the words of the Baltimore Catechism, are exercise of the spiritual works of mercy and the corporal works of mercy. That's what Francis is all about. Mm-hmm. 3 years ago, when he wrote his exhortation, Gaudium Evangelii, I was very impressed because almost every page leapt out at me as a pedagogical focus on liberationist practices. What can we do to free ourselves and free one another from the myths by which we are surrounded? What can we do to get over things like sound bites and advertisements on television and people telling us about Black Friday and things like that, you know? Just please God, deliver us. That one of the things our Father General Pedro Arrupe used to emphasize was our vocation is not to be consumers. Our vocation is to be living up to the potential of all the gifts and opportunities that God presents us in our experience on this planet.
Uh-huh. Are Jesuits living up to that, as you can see in your order?
Well, we do it higgledy-piggledy, you know. I mean, we're human beings, and so some are quite enthusiastic about Francis, some are a little cautious, but I think by and large we do want to accept his leadership, and our present Father General, Adolfo Nicolas, is certainly in conversation with the Holy Father at this time. So we're undergoing a process of development. Father Nicolas wants to retire, and we're going to be electing a new Father General. Mm-hmm. So I think we'll very much be taking our inspiration and following the pages of Pope Francis.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, he's opened up the windows, so many things in the short period of time that he's been Pope. Are you happy with where he's going and his directions?
Oh, personally, I'm very happy. Yeah. But I think he's made a lot of people uncomfortable. I mean, for one thing, we have the problem in the Catholic Church, and it's right here in the American Church, of clericalism. Now, a lot of progressive theologians and pastoral people view clericalism as sinful. You know, we're not about an elite. We are supposed to be presiding over the liturgy, the work of the people in our sacramental ministry, mm-hmm. and serving one another. So the idea of a separate branch of the clergy is really kind of foreign to our modern outlook on the church.
Uh-huh. Where would you like to see him go, or make other proclamations that would, for you personally or for the order, tickle your fancy, you might say?
Well, not so much for the order, but I think for the good of the church. Mm-hmm. What is going to be key will be his selection of prelates who are going to be the next generation of bishops. Will there be pastoral people who are oriented to service and following the goal of orthopraxis? Can we practice what we as a believing entity believe and preach?
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we have a vacuum of new priests and religious within the church, which is a major chessboard on trying to move people around and find pastors or priests for each church, each parish. How do you see that as advancing to try and engage young people, because that's where your life has been spent is in the classroom? How do you engage these young people maybe to enter the religious life? $64 million question.
Well,
huh?
That was going to be the next phrase that came out of my mouth, is that we're doing our best to pray for people to be attracted to this kind of life. I think a number of things in our modern mentality are being questioned by young people today. What is the value of voluntary celibacy? Will we ever have a married clergy? Will we ever have women ordained in our Catholic Church? Mm-hmm. Those are great unknowns, and I think people are weighing and considering. I think the best we can do is to try to lead by example and being present to people and talking with them.
Mm-hmm. Now, as I said, you've spent your life. What's the most exciting or interesting position that you have had in your 46 years to date as a Jesuit?
Well, I think it might have been in my years of directing the studies of younger Jesuits that for 8 years in the California province, I was interviewing our young men, and we went from a time when there was great anger in the early 70s to a bit more rational approach toward the life of studies and academic aspirations Then I went to Washington, D.C. and worked in the National Conference of the Jesuits with all the formation programs in the U.S. and Canada. And I think that really was a high point. We saw a lot of things that were very wonderful happening in the church and some things that were a little frightening. And I was involved at one time with Bishop Marshall of Burlington, Vermont, with the study of the Catholic seminaries in the United States. And the present Archbishop of Washington, Donald Wuerl, was his assistant. They were very kind to me, and in fact, once they assigned me to join their visitation team up at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley. And I joked up there because I had gone to school there my last quarter of theological studies, and I said, what have they done? Have they sent the fox back to guard the hen house here? But we got through that visitation, and I understand there was a subsequent visitation of American seminaries. Mm-hmm. America is viewed, unfortunately, very suspiciously by Europe.
What brings that on? Why is that the case?
Well, there's a hangover, I think, from the days of monarchy and a preoccupation with kind of the trappings of royalty, and we're a democratic society. We live according to our Bill of Rights in the American Constitution. Mm-hmm. That isn't understood by a lot of people in Europe. So freedom of speech, freedom of association, these things are all grounds for suspicion. Uh-huh. And so when our people speak out, like the American sisters, they don't understand that across the pond. And so we get into trouble with them.
They're basically suspicious of us then, of trying to overthrow them, so to speak, or do you think that
I don't really understand what their fears are. Uh-huh. I don't know whether or not they've experienced freedom in the same way we have with our Republican government. Mm-hmm. By Republican, I don't mean that party.
We realize that. Yeah. Now you're going to be leaving the Fresno diocese very shortly, and you're going to be going to Los Altos.
Correct. We have a retreat center up there, and they were looking for an elderly priest, which I now am, to help out with their sacramental ministry. The staff is small, and they have to be preparing retreat conferences and meeting with the retreatants there. So I have to give up my work here. I've really enjoyed going down to our parish, Immaculate Heart of Mary parish at Hanford, about 40 miles away, and working with Father Lesteri and mm-hmm. Kevin Jonas. Mm-hmm. I will miss those people very much. Mm-hmm. But it is time to do something different, and we take our direction from our superiors. So my superior asked me to move. Okay,
that's what I was going to ask you. Can you select a place that you might want to go at some time or another, or is it just an assignment that you accept?
Well, we can always indicate what we're interested in doing. A lot of that was my work when I was supervising the studies of the younger Jesuits, and I was sort of Mr. Interlocutor between the young Jesuits and the superiors to present what their talents and aspirations were and whether they could fit into the priorities of what our present mission in the California province was in those days. So we can always present, but the provincial has the last word. There's a great word that comes out of Ignatian spirituality, which is discernment. And I knew a priest who was a crusty fella, and he said the way that verb to discern is conjugated is, I discern, you discern, he decides. So then we get our job.
That's the boss, right?
That's right.
Is there a place in this world that you wanted to go to for some reason or another that you never got there?
No, I don't think I could say that. Uh-huh. I wanted to be a high school principal, but I was working with high school principals, and I was on boards of different high schools at different times, so I knew what was going on in that apostolate.
Yeah. What would you tell young people today, a young man who wants to enter the religious life? Why come to the Jesuits rather than going to 30 other orders that he might select?
Well, that's kind of a difficult question because does it put me in the position of being a predator?
Well, be a predator. Be a predator a little bit.
Yeah, but I mean, we're not out to deprive other religious orders or congregations of potential recruits, but I think that the way we operate, which is through openness with our superiors, is that we do have an opportunity to express who we are and work in concert with them through dialogue and take an assignment. Mm-hmm. And we really do have a variety of assignments. It's very different from being in one place or one diocese, and so we could be sent technically anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. But today there are plenty of opportunities to teach, to reach out, to be with people. A lot of our men are involved in community organization. Here in Fresno, we have a branch of PICO that was founded by Father John Bauman and Father Jerry Helfrich, working up in Oakland, and they're now international. They're working in Central America and Rwanda and around the globe, helping people to organize themselves and reach out. So I would say to a young person today, if you would understand what the modern missionary vocation is, it's not to go out and capture people and force them to be converts to Catholicism. It's really to interest them in the invitation of Jesus Christ to be all you can be.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like an army slogan, I think, isn't it? All you can be.
Well, yeah, I want to stay away from that.
But now you're ready to leave in a couple of months, I guess, and move on to that. And is there any time expectancy that you will be there for a period of a year or 2 years, or is that something that just comes up and they send you another letter and say you're moving on?
Well, a lot of it is also in God's hands. So I've had some serious health problems, and we'll see how that works out and how well I can satisfy the expectations of my superiors and the staff I'll be working with up there.
Yeah. Well, Father Denis, we really appreciate you taking the time and visiting with us today because, you've been doing a lot here in the diocese, going from different parishes, and as you said, in Hanford. So, again, we wish you Godspeed, and don't forget us when you get up. Los Altos is next to Silicon Valley, and the next thing you know, you'll be texting and doing all kinds of things for us. So, again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and as I said before, Godspeed.
Well, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Great.